I'm taking a slightly different approach today, although we're talking about best practices. I'm not going to mention hard-coded numbers, I think just once. So we're going to look at it more from a business perspective and what does it really mean to build a spreadsheet that actually works for a business long-term. So I've named it the most common challenges that people face when they're taking over someone else's spreadsheets, because I think that's the point where it all comes tumbling down and we realize what it is that we're facing. So I think if you think about if you've ever had that experience, some of the challenges were just overall struggles to make sense of the file, right? The purpose is unclear. You have hard-coded numbers, and I think this is the only time I'm actually mentioning that. And there's a significant amount of external links, and half of them are not working or they're connected to a completely wrong spreadsheet. Then I've had a couple of Bibles, that one spreadsheet that everyone uses, no one understands, but we keep on using it because that's how it's always been done. What else? No way of knowing if the final output of the spreadsheet is accurate. We just, again, run with it. It's kind of like it's built, it's working, we don't understand it, we're gonna keep on using it. Then you get a combination of extremely slow files, whether they're size-driven or they have too many dependent formulas, they have macros, pivots, like everything under the sun has been thrown in one spreadsheet and it doesn't work. And I think my personal favorite is that space in the last cell of the spreadsheet that just makes it kaboom. And then you also have macros. A lot of people don't understand them. So I've seen plenty of more advanced users putting macros in for all the right reasons, but then people don't know how to use them afterwards. So it just is what it is, right? And I think I've mentioned this one before. So the space added at the last row of the sheet. So the spreadsheets, they're huge. People go, nothing's wrong with them. I don't understand it. And it just slows everything down. So those are the most common challenges that people face, and they are really my happy place. So I've had 18 years of experience in finance overall, plus minus. I've done your traditional accounting roles, I've done commercial finance, your business partnering, your FP&A, and I kind of fell in love with systems, data, and processes. It's in every role that I've done, that seems to have been the thing that either makes everything work or make everything fall apart. So I've fallen in love with that. I've worked in 7 industries. I've done retail, manufacturing, logistics, financial leases, European projects, European institutions, and gaming, kids games actually. And I've had a chance in all of those ones to actually work across all of the areas and just be able to take all the things that I've learned and move them forward. I'm now doing consulting work on system implementation, reporting, process optimization, anything that has a heavy data-driven element to it. I focus a lot on training because, again, that's where everything falls apart, and training seems to be the thing that the project managers, they don't just allow for. So that's, again, where my happy place is. I've also created Finance Life Plan, which is a series of practical courses and coaching to help the finance professionals create the right career for them, and whatever is right for every individual is going to be different. And then in the last 4 years, I've done more than 1,200 hours of personal development courses and all sorts of courses, events in the personal development space. So if we then go back to our favorite topic, Excel, I've named it from good to great because I think that's really what we're talking about. And I think there's 5 big things that if we manage to wrap our heads around them, it really makes a difference in terms of the quality of the spreadsheets that we put out there. We have a thinking framework, we have scalability, readability, ease of maintenance, and controls, or manage by exception. So the thinking framework, this is something that came out from a series of interviews and conversations that I've had. And I remember I was interviewing someone for an FP&A position, and I asked them, what do you do when someone asks you for a report? Just walk me through your thought process and how do you approach that? So he said, well, they usually send me an email saying that they want the sales report. I go and put some data in a spreadsheet. I put a pivot on it and I send it back. I'm like, okay. And then we spend a couple of weeks going backwards and forwards on the email to just kind of get out of that report what we wanted. And that's a waste of time. Not to mention that's not what you want out of your FP&A function. But in general, if you have someone that's how they build a spreadsheet, then it's not really useful. By the time you're done with it, you might as well just stop halfway through because it's no longer relevant. So that's really where this thinking framework comes from, is before we even open up a spreadsheet, what is it that we do and how do we approach the process itself? So there's 5 steps to that. You identify the problem. So it goes back to start with the end in mind. Let's say you have your head of sales coming and asks for a sales report. Before you go, there's your sales report. just stop and go, okay, what is that sales report trying to help? Is it, I don't know, I want to know the performance of last month so I can focus on my marketing campaign or my discounts or promotions for next month. I want to expand into another region. I want to hire another sales rep. What is it that I want to do? So then when you build that spreadsheet, it actually helps to answer that business question rather than there's a spreadsheet with all the sales that you've done. You're the salesperson, you make sense of it. Because 9 times out of 10, they actually don't. So always start with the end in mind, no matter what it is that you're doing. Then this is where it's daunting and it's exciting at the same time. You imagine what the solutions could look like if there are no restrictions. You have everything you need and the data's clean and you have all the time in the world. What would you do with it? And I know it's wild because that's not the reality, but it does set your brain up for, okay, this is really what I want to build. If everything would work, this is what my ultimate report would look like. Okay. Then you start to go through, okay, what are my constraints? And it could be, well, I can't use Power BI because the business doesn't use that, it uses Google Sheets. Or I can't do this because the people using it are dummies and they don't get it. What constraints do I have to work with? At this point, you will also start to look at the data you have to work with. Up until this point, you shouldn't really touch it. So this is where you go, well, if I need to build a sales report that says I want to expand in another area, you go, what data do I have? And you might find that you have some data, but you're missing data, and you're going to start to have to make assumptions. And you're going to be able at that point to justify, this is what I'm trying to do. This is the data that I have. This is the assumptions that I'm going to have to make. And then you also try to validate the assumptions you make, either by talking to colleagues or looking at other businesses, industry standards, whatever it is that's available, depending on what it is you're trying to do. Okay? And then you refine the solution to address the constraints that you've identified. And the last step is you create, you implement, and you probably end up doing some tweaking to it as well. But before we move on, if you don't take this approach, the risk you're having is you go, well, I need to build this sales report. Oh, I only know how to use some ifs and VLOOKUPs. I can't build it. Because you're focusing on what can you do in Excel rather than really what is it that I'm trying to answer and how is this going to help the business going forward. And I think in terms of purely personal selfish, when you take this approach, it does help make you feel that you're more part of the business and you're actually helping the business in one way, shape, or form. And I think a lot of us, often we feel like a back-end function that no one cares about. If we're not there tomorrow, it doesn't matter. But it does. We just need to learn how to position ourselves differently a little bit and stop going, you wanted an email, a report, there's your report, you go make sense of it. So I think the tools are in our hands. And I've used this framework myself. I've taught it to the people that I've worked with. And I think with a bit of practice, it starts to change the way you think, and it does start to make a difference because you start to position yourself as a business partner purely by going, well, what is it that you're trying to solve? Okay. Then if we start to talk about scalability. So questions like, is this going to be a one-off or is it going to be used multiple times? If it's a one-off and you've kind of done your own due diligence and you agree that it's a one-off rather than we think it is, but we know it's not, there's no point in spending a month building something that's really going to be used as a one-off. So you might take some shortcuts or you might do some things that otherwise you wouldn't do when you build a model that's going to be used multiple times. Are there any future business changes that will impact the file that I need to account for? So I was asked to build a payroll forecasting model that was just supposed to be for a 12-month period. The business at the time was going through so much change that I ended up accounting for 3 changes for every individual. So in job titles, in departments, in salaries, 3 changes in the course of a year. So those sort of things will have an impact on your end product, how quickly you're able to turn that around, how useful it's going to be, and also how accurate it's going to be. So this is where scalability comes into play. And then also how many variables you need to account for: departments, months, exchange rates, locations, currencies. The exchange rate is one that catches out quite a lot of people, especially with budgeting, for example. A lot of companies, they budget using a fixed exchange rate for the year, which is fine. But then you have some years in which the difference between 2-3 months is so wild that it's actually significant to the budget. And if you've only built in one exchange rate, then you can't actually rerun your budget with the new exchange rate to see what an adjusted version of it looks like because you're not set up that way. So hey ho, overnight someone has to build a new model. Okay, so that's scalability. Then readability. This might sound a bit strange. So that's just a super easy formula. If this is that, if that is that. Now, readability matters in terms of someone else, you're on holiday, someone else takes the file over, or you've left the business, someone else needs to take it and maintain it. This formula is easy when you look at it. If you were to write it this way, it'll be a lot easier to read through. And I know there's probably some of you, and I've looked at this going, well, actually, this is an easy one, so it doesn't make sense, right? But then you have a formula like this. Yeah, good luck reading that. And I know that formula works because what that does is it returns actually shares and 15.5%. And what it is, it's a dynamic report that says, well, you can put the quarter in, and depending on the quarter you've selected, it'll tell you your top 5 performing categories and the percentage of total sales that they have. But writing this formula in a different way would help actually someone else kind of troubleshoot it. When it stops working, why? And what is it trying to do? And really, that's one big index match. So it's not something that we tend to think about, but it is something that we stumble across when we pick up someone else's files. Okay, ease of maintenance. So how can I set it up so that maintenance is as easy as possible? Now, I like to set mine up where they're clearly defined. So I put those colored tabs, they're just empty sheets, but I tend to name this category of spreadsheets, this is all for summary, so they're all outputs. Anything that's a working file or something that the user shouldn't be bothered about, it goes in that black section. And by breaking it down where you go workings, raw data, mapping table, whomever picks that one up, they start to understand the logic of that file instead of everything just being thrown all over the place. They kind of go, okay, so if I need to put some raw data, then maybe I need to go and check the tabs in between this and that. It makes it easier. If you have files with, I don't know, 50 tabs, maybe number them. So then it kind of goes, okay, if I start at number 1, maybe that's the logical way. It's just kind of go, okay, how does my brain naturally process things? And let me try to apply that because it's going to be easier for someone else. Can I link it to some external files? So anything, think about exchange rate, for example. If instead of asking the user to update exchange rates in your file, if you know there is a central file that gets updated regularly by someone, then just link into that. You reduce manual work, you know your spreadsheet is never going to be out of date, and you kind of just make life a little bit easier. And link into that with the right formulas, so then you don't have to open it up. Who will be maintaining the file on a day-to-day basis? No disrespect to anyone, but there are at times where you have teams where people just don't know how to use a spreadsheet. So you have to, when you're building it, you have to be mindful of who's going to be maintaining that. And I've met a lot of people that are extremely smart with Excel that have, either on purpose or not, managed to pigeonhole themselves into, I'm the only person that can fix a spreadsheet in this company. Which means you can't leave, or if you leave that company at a really disadvantage. So that could work both ways. Really depends on how you want to position yourself. But going with who's going to maintain it is just going to maybe help you think about structuring it differently. And then the last one, this is my favorite. It's all about controls. So I manage by exception. I want to know that the spreadsheet does what it needs to do, but I want it to shout at me when it doesn't. So I kind of go, my brain goes worst case scenario, and I just go and put controls in for everything that I could think of. And this is an ongoing process. So anytime you release that file into production, call it that way, or it becomes a file that's being used regularly, you want to go back and keep on updating this particular section. So for example, check if the amount of the output matches the input, as in, have I lost anything along the way? So I have a file, for example, that I've built where we want to upload invoices into the accounting system coming from a different system. So in that, you'll check, have I raised these invoices before? If the answer is yes, then you kind of like, okay, you go to this side. From whatever is left, can I raise it? Yes or no? If it's yes, then you go into this bucket. If it's no, you go here because I need to look into you. And at the end, if you add up those 3 categories, you need to match to what you've started with. If not, you end up having duplications somewhere, or rows lost, or something somewhere didn't go the way you intended it to go. Okay. For example, if you're using a macro, this was another example. The first 2 weeks of joining a company, the financial controller comes to me and she goes, I've been here for 6 months. I know this file is broken. I just don't know why it's broken or how to fix it. And what they had is a macro that the first 10,000 rows, copy them across some spreadsheets, do some calculations to it, and then turn them into a journal. What had happened is the input, the raw data, went over to about 100,000 rows. So the macro only did the first 10,000 because that's what it was set up to do. And a control in this case would have just been an easy 10,000 minus the maximum of your input tab. And if you get a negative number, then you kind of go, well, your macro's wrong. And this is how you go about updating it. So a lot of the times, like controls, they're not overly complicated processes that you put in place with, I don't know, walks and checklists and things like that. It's just, okay, if I've built something that has a limited range, let me just flag it to whoever's going to be using this file. If this stops working or if this starts looking weird, then that's potentially where it's coming from. It's also useful for you if you pick up that file in 6 months again, because you're not going to know where it's coming from. If you're using Power Query, for example, you can use that for repetition or human error. Another company that I worked for, they were copying information from multiple spreadsheets to do a consolidation file, and London ended up being in China. And the best part is they've sent that to the customer, and the customer came back saying, this doesn't look right. So little silly things like this actually affects credibility, reputation, really depends on the situation you're in, right? And my personal experience in finance is it's quite hard to gain the trust of the wider business, but it's extremely easy to lose it. And I think all it takes is one of those examples where London is in China to kind of just lose a lot of that credibility that you've worked so hard to build. And my last point in here is all about color coding and data validation. So if I build something that I hand over to a user, anything that I need a user to touch is going to be in yellow. Everything else is going to be locked. So I tell them and I put it in a tab that kind of goes, this is how you're supposed to use the file. But still, for protection, just lock everything else. If you're expecting them to put in a date, put a data validation for that. So make it idiot-proof in a way, and with all the right intentions. But just people at times just they're in a rush and they don't know what to do. So the more you manage to stop the errors at that point, the less it goes back to that whole credibility point. They just know how to use it, it works, and they know that that's something that they can rely on. And I think that's all I wanted to go through. I know it's a different approach on don't hard code numbers and do this and do that, but I think from a business standpoint, this is what makes the difference between a finance team that actually helps move the business forward and spreadsheets, reports, Power BIs, whatever they're built on, as long as they're purposeful, then that's where the finance and the individual itself, we can start to move towards a place of business partners and adding value and not a back-end function.